When we conjure up images of the Roaring Twenties and the Prohibition era, the mind almost immediately defaults to a specific set of visual tropes. We see the Tommy guns, the fedoras, the smoky backrooms filled with men in pinstripe suits, and the looming heavy shadow of Al Capone over Chicago. It is a history written in gunpowder and testosterone.
It is the history of the gangster, the G-man, and the male politician. But if you look closer at the sepia-tone photographs of the speakeasies or dig into the court records of the Volstead Act violations, you realize that half the picture is missing. You realize that standing right next to the mob bosses and often outsmarting them were women. Exactly. We are conditioned to think of women in the 1920s in two very distinct, very passive categories. On one side, you have the temperance crusader, the grim-faced matron smashing barrels with an axe. On the other, the flapper, the party girl who was just there to dance and look pretty while the men did the business. But the reality was far more complex and far more lucrative. Women weren't just consumers of the illicit culture of the 1920s. They were the architects of it. They were running the speakeasies, they were driving the rum-running boats, they were smuggling whiskey in their corsets, and they were building empires that rivaled the men. Today, we are going to tear down the male-dominated narrative of the dry years. We are looking at the Bahama queen who stared down the British government. We are looking at the queen of the nightclubs who made a fortune telling judges she was just a hostess. We are looking at the women who utilized the very sexism of their era as a shield to commit organized crime. Welcome to the untold history of the hidden half of the underworld. This is the story of the women of Prohibition. To understand how women seized power during Prohibition, we have to understand the immense irony of how Prohibition started. It was effectively a woman's movement. The 18th Amendment didn't just appear out of thin air. It was the result of decades of organizing by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Right, in the 19th century and early 20th century, alcohol was viewed by these organizations as the destroyer of the home. Men would go to the saloon, spend their wages, get drunk, come home, and abuse their wives and children. Because women had very few legal rights and often couldn't vote, they saw banning alcohol as a way to protect themselves. So you have this moral crusade. In 1920, the 18th Amendment goes into effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. And almost simultaneously, you have the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. These two massive constitutional changes collided. It created a vacuum. The Old World saloon was a male-only space. Respectable women did not drink in public bars. If a woman was in a saloon in 1910, she was assumed to be a prostitute. But when the saloons were outlawed and the speakeasies went underground, the rules of Victorian society shattered. That is a critical point. The speakeasy was an illicit space. It didn't follow the social codes of the sidewalk. Because it was illegal for everyone to be there, everyone was suddenly equal in their criminality. Men and women started drinking together in public for the first time in American history on a mass scale. Enter the flapper, the new woman. She bobbed her hair, she shortened her skirts, she smoked cigarettes, and she drank gin. But here is where the history usually stops. We focus on the social rebellion, but we miss the economic opportunity that opened up. The law enforcement of the time was incredibly chivalrous, in a chauvinistic way. Male police officers and judges simply could not conceive of women as masterminds of crime. They looked for guys with scars and guns. They didn't look for the grandmother with an apron or the socialite in a fur coat.
And savvy women realized this immediately. If a man drives a truck full of crates, he gets pulled over. If a woman drives a sedan with her children in the back, the police tip their hats and wave her through. That gender bias became the greatest asset for female bootleggers. Let's get into the specifics because the characters here are larger than life. We have to start with the absolute superstar of the era, Texas Guinan. She wasn't a bootlegger in the sense of driving trucks, but she was the public face of the speakeasy culture in New York City. Mary Louise Cecilia Guinan. She was originally from Waco, Texas, hence the nickname. She had been a vaudeville actress and a silent film cowgirl, but she found her true calling as a hostess. She ran the 300 Club, the El Fay, the Texas Guinan Club. She was the woman who greeted every customer with the famous line, "Hello, sucker." And they loved it. She openly mocked her wealthy patrons for spending exorbitant amounts of money on illicit champagne, and that only made them spend more. But what makes Guinan fascinating is how she handled the law. Her clubs were raided constantly, but she never kept the liquor on her person or even in the room. The booze was brought in by the customers or kept in a secure location nearby. When the police would raid, she would just have the band play the prisoner's song and make jokes. She was arrested multiple times, but she always claimed she was just the hostess and had no idea alcohol was being served. Juries loved her. She famously told a judge during one trial regarding a raid, "Judge, I never sell a drink, I just sell the atmosphere." And she was making thousands of dollars a week, which in the 1920s was an astronomical fortune. She proved that a woman could hold court over the chaotic nightlife of New York City. But while Dinan was the face, other women were the muscle and the logistics. Let's talk about Gertrude Cleo Lithgow. She was known as the Queen of the Bahamas. This wasn't a hostess, this was a wholesale international importer. Cleo Lithgow is a fascinating figure because she was a licensed liquor wholesaler in Nassau. Remember, alcohol was legal in the Bahamas. The trick was getting it from the Bahamas to the U.S. coast, which was illegal under U.S. law. She set up shop in Nassau and became the middleman between the European distilleries and the American rum runners. And it was a cutthroat world. You had captains trying to steal cargo, you had rival gangs, and you had the U.S. Coast Guard. Cleo was described as striking, beautiful, but absolutely terrifying if you crossed her. There's a story where she actually went down to the docks and physically confronted a captain who was trying to shortchange her on a shipment of scotch. She didn't rely on male protectors. She carried a pistol, she managed her own ledgers, and she negotiated directly with the biggest bootleggers of the era. At one point, she was even detained and interrogated by British officials who were under pressure from the U.S. to crack down, but she knew the law better than they did. She argued that she was a legitimate businesswoman under British law, and she was right. Then you move from the high seas to the back roads. We have to talk about Willie Carter Sharp. She was from Roanoke, Virginia. Now, Virginia is moonshine country. Franklin County is the moonshine capital of the world, but Willie Carter Sharp wasn't making it, she was running it. This is where the legend of the rum-running driver comes in. We usually think of Junior Johnson and the roots of NASCAR, but Willie Carter Sharp was right there. She modified her cars. She had a Cadillac with heavy-duty springs to handle the weight of the liquor and a button on the dashboard that could release a smoke screen from the exhaust pipe to blind pursuing police cars.
That sounds like James Bond, but it was 1926 Virginia. She hauled hundreds of thousands of gallons of whiskey into Roanoke. She testified later that between 1926 and 1931, she moved over 220,000 gallons. And the police? They often didn't stop her because, again, she was a woman driving a nice car. Sometimes she would even have a diamond stick pin in her tie. She treated it like a sport. She loved the chase. When she was finally caught and put on trial, her testimony captivated the nation. She was unashamed. She saw herself as a provider of a service that people wanted. And she wasn't alone in the physical smuggling aspect. There was a woman named Spanish Marie Waite. Marie Waite ran a flotilla of boats off the coast of Florida. She was involved in the rum row operations, where ships would anchor just outside U.S. territorial waters, and smaller, faster boats would run the product to shore. She was incredibly successful because she used radio technology to coordinate her fleet, staying one step ahead of the Coast Guard. There was a distinct advantage women had in the courtroom, too. It was called pleading the belly in the old days, but in the 1920s, it was just the sympathy factor. Juries were reluctant to send mothers to prison. There was a case in Seattle of a woman named Olmsted, related to the famous Olmsted wiretapping case. She was involved, but the legal system twisted itself into knots to avoid treating her as a hard criminal. And we can't forget the women who operated on a smaller but vile scale, the henhouse bootleggers. These were widows, mothers, women struggling to make ends meet who realized they could brew beer or distill spirits in their kitchen and sell it to the neighbors. It was economic survival. In cities like Chicago and Detroit, this kitchen drinking culture was massive. One of the most tragic examples of the low-level female bootlegger was a woman named Mary Wozniak, known in the press as Moonshine Mary. She was a Polish immigrant living in Illinois. She wasn't a glamour girl like Texas Gwinnett. She was selling liquor to support her family. But she sold a batch that was tainted, likely with wood alcohol. That was the great danger of Prohibition. Without regulation, you didn't know what you were drinking. The man who drank her liquor died. Mary was charged with murder. She became the first woman in Illinois to be convicted of murder for selling poison liquor. The press demonized her, calling her a witch and a poisoner, completely ignoring the desperate poverty that drove her to sell the stuff in the first place. It shows the double standard. When Al Capone's organization killed people, it was business. When a poor immigrant woman sold bad booze by accident, she was a monster. But despite the risks, women stayed in the game. In fact, some estimates suggest that women were 4 times less likely to be suspected of bootlegging than men, making them the perfect couriers. They used fashion, too. There were specially designed flasks that curved to fit the thigh, held up by a garter. There were bootlegger corsets and hollowed-out heels and shoes. A woman could walk down Fifth Avenue carrying 2 quarts of gin on her body, and no male police officer would dare frisk her. Let's talk about the specific dynamics of the speakeasy management again. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about the atmosphere. Women like Helen Morgan and Belle Livingston created spaces that felt sophisticated. They introduced food, entertainment, and table service. The old saloon was about drinking to get drunk, standing at a rail. The female-run speakeasy was about nightlife. Belle Livingston is a great character. She was an older woman, a former showgirl, who ran a high-end speakeasy called the Country Club in Manhattan. She charged a membership fee. She made it exclusive. When the agents finally raided her place, she famously tried to escape across the roof in her evening gown, but she was in her 50s and not exactly an athlete. She got caught, but the press loved her spirit.
This era also saw the rise of women in the legal profession defending these crimes. Mabel Walker Willebrandt was the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, the highest-ranking woman in the federal government at the time. She was the one tasked with enforcing Prohibition. So you have this incredible dynamic. The most famous bootleggers were women, and the woman hunting them down was also breaking glass ceilings. Willebrandt, known as the First Lady of Law, was frustrated by how easily women evaded the law. She pushed for harder sentences, but she was fighting an uphill battle against the cultural perception of women. She famously ordered raids at all hours, trying to catch the big fish, but she often noted that the wets, the anti-prohibitionists, used women as shields. It's also worth noting the African-American women in this trade. In Harlem, the buffet flats and rent parties were a huge part of the economy. Women like Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, ran the numbers game and the bootlegging operations in Harlem. She was fierce. She stood up to the white mobsters, including Dutch Schultz, who tried to muscle in on her territory. Queenie St. Clair is a legend. She actually took out ads in the newspaper denouncing police corruption. She testified against corrupt officers. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a community leader in a twisted sense, protecting her neighborhood's economic interests from the downtown syndicates. She retired wealthy and lived to be an old woman, which is rare in that line of work. So, Prohibition ends in 1933. The 21st Amendment passes. What was the fallout for women? Did they just go back to the kitchen? Not at all. The genie was out of the bottle. Prohibition had fundamentally changed the social landscape. Before 1920, a respectable woman did not drink at a bar. By 1933, it was socially acceptable for men and women to socialize together in cocktail lounges, nightclubs, and restaurants. The speakeasy culture became cocktail culture. The mixed-gender social space was permanent. Women had claimed their right to public leisure. But there was also the economic side. The women who made fortunes, like Texas Gwinnett or Queenie St. Clair, proved that women had business acumen. However, as the liquor industry went legitimate again, it went back to being male-dominated. The big distilleries and corporate distributors were run by men. The female bootleggers were pushed out because the illicit edge was their advantage. They could operate in the shadows where men were watched. Once it was out in the open, the corporate suits took over. That's a sad but common pattern. But the cultural shift was undeniable. The flapper archetype of the 20s, independent, sexually liberated, economically active, laid the groundwork for the feminist movements that would follow. They normalized the idea that a woman's place was wherever she wanted it to be, whether that was a voting booth or a bar stool. It also changed fashion and behavior forever. Cigarettes, cosmetics, short hair, these were all symbols of the Prohibition rebel. The marketing industries realized women were a massive consumer base for vices that were previously male-only. It was a liberation, but it was also the commodification of that liberation. So the next time you watch a movie about the 1920s and see the gangsters shooting it out, remember the women who were driving the getaway cars, smuggling the scotch, and running the show. They were the mothers of invention in a dry world, and they proved that when the law tries to hold people back, women are often the first to find a way around it.
And then, almost overnight, Prohibition shatters that rule. By making alcohol illegal, the government accidentally made it sexy. Suddenly, drinking wasn't just a vice for the working man coming off a factory shift. It became a thrill for the rebellious youth. And because the speakeasy was an underground, illegal operation, the old rules of social etiquette didn't apply. The speakeasy owners didn't care about Victorian morals, they cared about greenbacks. If a woman had money and wanted a gin Ricky, she was getting a gin Ricky.
Exactly. The illegal nature of the business leveled the playing field between the sexes in a way that suffrage alone hadn't quite managed socially. You have the rise of the date. Before this, courting was a parlor affair, supervised by parents. Now, young men and women were going out together into these dark, smoke-filled rooms to listen to jazz and drink illegal liquor. And this is where we see the flapper archetype explode onto the scene. It's impossible to separate the flapper from Prohibition. They are symbiotic. It's the ultimate teenage rebellion on a national scale. You cut your hair into a bob, you shorten your skirt to the knee, which was scandalous, and you carry a flask. That image, the woman with the flask tucked into a garter, became the icon of the age. But it wasn't just about consumption, was it? We tend to think of the women of Prohibition as these party girls dancing the Charleston, but that ignores the women who looked at the Volstead Act and saw a massive business opportunity. That is the pivotal pivot point. While Al Capone and Bugs Moran were grabbing headlines with machine guns, women were quietly, and sometimes very loudly, taking over the operational side of the industry. We have to talk about Mary Louise Cecilia Goonan, better known to the world as Texas Goonan. If Al Capone was the muscle of Prohibition, Texas Goonan was the face and the voice. She wasn't hiding in a back alley. She was standing center stage. The queen of the nightclubs. I love her story because she was already older than the typical flopper when Prohibition hit. She was a former vaudeville actress, a cowgirl in silent westerns, and she took that theatrical training and applied it to the speakeasy. She opened the 300 Club in New York, and it became the most famous spot in the city. Her catchphrase is still legendary. "Hello, sucker." That was how she greeted her customers. Imagine that. You walk into an illegal club, you are about to pay $25 for a bottle of champagne that probably costs $2 to make and tastes like sparkling vinegar, and the hostess greets you by openly calling you an idiot for spending your money. And the people loved it. They ate it up. It was part of the nihilism of the era. She made a fortune, something like $700,000 a year in 1920s money. That is an astronomical amount of money. That's millions today. And she did it by controlling the atmosphere. But she also had to deal with the law. She was arrested constantly, wasn't she? Constantly. But she treated her arrests like press junkets. She would be raided, the police would drag her out to the paddy wagon, and she would be wearing her diamonds, waving to the photographers, blowing kisses to the cops. She turned the judicial process into a farce. When she went to court, she would charm the judges. She famously claimed she never sold a drop of alcohol in her life. She said, "I just provide the mixers and the entertainment. If the guests bring their own frosks, that's their business." It was a lie, of course, but it was a brilliant legal gray area she exploited. It highlights how unprepared the legal system was for female criminals. The police knew how to beat a confession out of a low-level thug. They didn't know how to handle a charismatic woman in a fur coat who had the press eating out of her hand. But Texas Goonan was the front of house. What about the supply chain? Because moving the liquor was where the real danger was.
That brings us to the high seas and a woman named Gertrude Lithgow. They called her the Bahama Queen. Now, unlike Guinan, Lithgow wasn't an entertainer. She was a logistics expert. She set up shop in Nassau in the Bahamas, which was the hub for rum running. British merchants would ship top-shelf liquor to Nassau, and then rum runners would load it onto smaller, faster boats to sprint across to Florida or up the coast to Rum Row off New York. And this wasn't a soft job. Nassau was swarming with cutthroats, con artists, and desperate sailors. A single woman setting up a wholesale liquor export business there should have been eaten alive. How did she survive? She survived by being tougher than the men. Gertrude Lithgow was known for her icy stare. There's a story where a rival bootlegger tried to intimidate her into using his ships for her product. She essentially told him that she would sooner pour her liquor into the ocean than let him touch a crate of it. She carried a pistol, she managed the accounts, and she had a reputation for honesty in a dishonest trade. In the underworld, your word is your bond. If Gertrude said the scotch was real import and not bathtub swill, you could bank on it. That gave her power. It's interesting that she operated out of the Bahamas because it gave her a buffer. She wasn't technically breaking U.S. law until the product crossed the line, but she was facilitating it. Did the U.S. government ever catch up to her? They tried, but she was elusive. She eventually retired from the game with her money intact, which is rare. Most bootleggers ended up dead or in Alcatraz. Gertrude Lithgow walked away. But if we move from the ocean to the backroads, we find another fascinating demographic, the driving women, the rum-running drivers. This is the era where car culture is really taking off too. You have faster cars, paved roads appearing, and you have women like Willie Carter Sharp. She's one of my favorites because she completely disrupts the idea that women were bad drivers. She was a precision driver for rum-running gangs in Virginia. Willie Carter Sharp is a legend in Franklin County, Virginia, which is often called the moonshine capital of the world. She started hauling moonshine in her 20s. We are talking about high-speed chases over dirt roads, at night with no headlights to avoid detection, carrying hundreds of gallons of volatile liquor in the back. She modified her cars, Cadillacs mostly. She had smoke screens installed to blind police cars chasing her. She had armor plating put in the back seat to stop bullets. A smoke screen? Like something out of a spy movie? Exactly like that, but in 1926. She testified later that she had moved over 200,000 gallons of whiskey between 1926 and 1931. And the reason she was so successful initially was, again, gender bias. Police officers looking for bootleggers were profiling men. They were looking for a rough-looking guy in a cap. They weren't looking for a well-dressed woman driving a nice Cadillac. She would breeze right through roadblocks. That camouflage was a common theme. I read about women who would simulate pregnancy to hide contraband. They would construct these special aprons or undergarments that could hold multiple flasks or even flat tins of alcohol against their bodies. A police officer in the 1920s was not going to pat down a respectable-looking pregnant woman. It would have been a career-ending scandal. The apron technique was widespread. There was a specific device called a bootlegger's bustle that some women wore, but it went even deeper into the domestic disguise. There were thousands of women who ran blind pigs or small-time speakeasies out of their kitchens. It was the perfect cover. A woman cooking in her kitchen is the most innocent image in American life. But in reality, she's distilling gin in the bathtub or fermenting wine in the cellar. It allowed widows and single mothers to support their families when there were very few other economic options.
That economic necessity is a huge part of this story. We focus on the glamour of the flopper, but for a lot of women, prohibition was a survival strategy. Take Maggie Bailey, for instance. She wasn't a flopper. She was a mountain woman. Maggie Bailey, the queen of the mountain bootleggers. She lived in Harlan County, Kentucky. She started selling moonshine to support her family, and she kept doing it for decades. She was beloved in her community because she wasn't a violent gangster. She was a community pillar. She used her bootlegging money to send kids to college, to help neighbors who were sick. When the federal agents finally tried to prosecute her, they had a terrible time finding a jury that would convict her because she was Aunt Maggie to everyone. This brings us to the legal headache that women posed. You have this clash between the law and the cultural perception of womanhood. There is this fascinating statistic that female bootleggers were far less likely to serve jail time than men. Why was that? It was the crying mother defense. Defense attorneys knew that if they put a woman on the stand and she cried and she talked about her children and she claimed she was only doing it because her husband was sick or dead, male juries would melt. They couldn't bring themselves to send a mother to prison. There was a famous case in Chicago where a woman named Simona Seworth was caught with a massive operation, guns, cash, booze, but she played the role of the innocent girl led astray, and she got off with a slap on the wrist compared to what a man would have gotten. But not everyone in the legal system was falling for it. We have to introduce the antagonist to these women, Mabel Walker Willebrandt, the First Lady of Law. Mabel Walker Willebrandt was the Assistant Attorney General of the United States from 1921 to 1929. She was the highest-ranking woman in the federal government, and ironically, it was her job to enforce prohibition. She was brilliant, tireless, and she had zero patience for the soft treatment of bootleggers, male or female. She famously told her prosecutors, "Give me no excuses, give me convictions." It's a fascinating dynamic. You have women breaking the law to gain independence, and you have a woman enforcing the law who has achieved the highest level of independence within the system. Willebrandt was actually urging the Coast Guard to be more aggressive against the rum runners. She was the one who figured out that you could get Al Capone on tax evasion. That was her strategy, correct. While the G-men get the credit in the movies, it was Willebrandt who developed the tax prosecution strategy. But even she struggled with the public perception of female criminals. The newspapers loved to romanticize them. There was a woman named Spanish Marie Waite. She ran a fleet of rum-running boats off the coast of Florida. The press described her as this exotic, beautiful pirate queen. They focused on her looks, her mystery. Willebrandt just wanted her in a cell. Spanish Marie is a great example of the radio technology aspect, too. She supposedly used high-tech radio equipment to coordinate her ships and intercept Coast Guard frequencies. This wasn't amateur hour.
These women were adopting technology faster than the law enforcement could keep up. But let's go back to the speakeasy floor for a moment. We talked about ownership, but what about the employment? The cigarette girls, the hostesses? That was the other side of the coin. The speakeasy created a massive demand for female labor. In a saloon, there were no hostesses. In a speakeasy, the hostess was key to the illusion of a party. It provided jobs for thousands of women, but it also put them in dangerous proximity to organized crime. You had dancers and singers who were effectively working for the mob. It blurred the lines between the entertainment industry and the criminal underworld.
And it changed the social fabric of dating. We touched on it earlier, but the treating culture. Before Prohibition, men treated other men to drinks. Now, men were treating women. It created a new social economy where women had leverage. They were the ones choosing which speakeasy to go to. If a club wasn't female-friendly, if the powder room wasn't nice, if the jazz wasn't good, the women wouldn't go. And if the women wouldn't go, the men wouldn't go. So women effectively dictated the marketplace of illegal alcohol. That is a brilliant point. The consumer power of women shaped the aesthetics of the jazz age. The speakeasies had to clean up their act compared to the old saloons. They had to have tablecloths, nice glassware, good music. It civilized the drinking experience in a weird way, even though it was illegal. It paved the way for the modern nightclub and the modern cocktail bar. The cocktail itself, the sugary, fruity mixed drink, became popular largely to mask the taste of bad alcohol for female palates, or at least that was the bartender's logic. So we have the flapper, the club owner, the smuggler, the driver, and the moonshiner. It's a full ecosystem. But as we move toward the end of the 20s, things start to get darker. The violence ramps up, the St. Valentine's Day massacre happens. Did women get caught in the crossfire? They did. As the syndicates consolidated power, the independent operators, male and female, were squeezed out. The mom-and-pop bootlegging operations were either absorbed by the mob or crushed. And the women who were associated with gangsters often paid a heavy price. We see the rise of the gun mall architect. But unlike the entrepreneurs we discussed, the gun malls were often victims or accessories rather than bosses. However, there were exceptions. There were women who took over their husbands' operations after they were killed. The widow's inheritance, it's a classic trope, but it happened. If you knew the suppliers and the routes, why stop just because your husband got shot? But I want to circle back to the end of Prohibition, 1933, repeal. What happens to these women? Does Texas Guinan open a legal bar? Texas Guinan actually died right before repeal, in late 1933. It's almost poetic. She belonged to the Prohibition era, and she left the stage just as the curtain came down. But for many others, repeal was actually a disaster. Legalization brought regulation, taxes, and corporate control. The liquor industry went back to being a male-dominated corporate structure. You couldn't run a legal distillery in your bathtub. You couldn't run a legal bar with expensive licenses that were hard for women to get. So in a strange irony, the criminalization of alcohol gave women more economic opportunity than the legal market did. Precisely. The black market is an equal opportunity employer. It doesn't care about your gender. It cares about your competence and your hustle. Once the market was legitimized, the old boys club reasserted control. Women were pushed back out of the production and distribution side and relegated to being consumers or waitresses again. The lady bootlegger vanished because the job no longer existed, but the cultural damage, or the cultural progress, depending on how you view it, was done. You couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. Women had spent 13 years drinking in public, dancing with strangers, driving fast cars, and managing businesses. They weren't going to just put on a corset and go back to the parlor. No, the social revolution was permanent. Prohibition bridged the gap between the suffragettes of the 1910s and the liberated women of the mid-century. It normalized the idea of women in the public sphere. It normalized women handling money, making decisions, and taking up space in nightlife. And we have to remember, this was happening simultaneously with the first years of women having the right to vote. The 19th Amendment passes in 1920, right at the start of Prohibition. So you have political liberation and social rebellion happening in lockstep. It's the perfect storm. And yet, when we watch movies about Prohibition, it's always guys in fedoras with Tommy guns. Why have these women been erased from the popular narrative?
I think it's because violence sells, and the male narrative of Prohibition is defined by violence. Capone, the massacres, the street wars. The female narrative of Prohibition is defined by evasion, wit, and business acumen.
It's less cinematic in a bang-bang sense, but it's more interesting sociologically. Also, the women themselves wanted to be erased. After repeal, many of them went back to normal lives. They didn't want their grandkids knowing they were running rum across the border. They buried their pasts to regain respectability. That makes sense. Grandmothers don't usually brag about their felony convictions. But looking back now, with the benefit of a century, we can see them for what they were. They were pioneers of a sort. They broke the glass ceiling with a bottle of gin. A very apt metaphor. And I think we need to give credit to the sheer diversity of them. We've talked about the rich showgirls and the poor mountain women, the city slickers and the sea captains. Prohibition cut across every class line. There was a wealthy socialite in DC who was caught bootlegging, and she said she did it for the excitement. Meanwhile, a mother in Chicago did it to buy bread. The motivation varied, but the act was the same, a rebellion against a law they saw as unjust. And let's not forget the sheer scale of the failure of the noble experiment. It failed partly because of women. The temperance movement that helped pass Prohibition was largely female-led. They thought banning alcohol would protect the home. But the women of the 20s rejected that. They voted with their dollars and their lifestyles against the very law their mothers had fought for. It was a generational rejection. That generational conflict is the heartbeat of the 1920s. The temperance mother versus the flapper daughter. One wanted to close the saloon to save the family. The other wanted to open the speakeasy to find herself. In the end, the daughter won. The culture shifted toward personal liberty and away from moral legislation. And the women we've discussed today, Guinan, Lithgow, Bailey, Sharp, they were the shock troops of that culture war. It forces us to rethink the term organized crime. We usually think of a hierarchy of men, but in the 20s, there was a horizontal network of women that was just as effective. I want to touch on one more figure before we wrap up, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. Even the high society wasn't immune. Oh, absolutely. The Vanderbilt case is a prime example of how deep the rot went. But it also shows the glamour. Prohibition made criminals into celebrities. If you were a woman who could get the good stuff, you were the most popular person at the party. It inverted the social hierarchy. The bootlegger was more important than the mayor. And for a brief, chaotic window of 13 years, the rules were suspended. Women could be bad, and being bad paid very, very well. It was a golden age of female outlawry that we really haven't seen since. We have female criminals today, of course, but the widespread, socially acceptable participation of women in an illegal economy, that was unique to Prohibition. It was a moment where the law was so out of step with the people that breaking it became a badge of honor, and women wore that badge just as proudly as the men. So the next time you see a picture of a flapper, don't just look at the dress or the hair. Look at the flask. Think about who filled it, who sold it, and who drove it through the night to get it there. There's a good chance a woman's hand was on that bottle every step of the way. From the Bahama Queen to the Queen of the nightclubs to the housewives of the Cumberlands, the women of Prohibition were not spectators. They were the engine. And their story deserves to be poured out, straight up, no chaser.